My name is Ann Haag, and I am the practice management advisor here at the Chicago Bar Association. And we're here today to talk about how to hire the right candidate. We are having a webcast camera issue, and so there might be somebody in and out to kind of fix it, so just disregard. So the first thing that I want to talk about are the common barriers to hiring that you hear about with law firms. On average, it takes about 42 days to fill an open position. That's a lot of time. I think when somebody announces that they're leaving or they quit, I think people start doing that mental math and really dread it about how long it's going to take to fill, especially with attorneys who are relying on that support from their staff. So it takes time. You have to search for a new candidate, screen, interview, and then the onboarding process. And so it's going to be at least a couple months before you have somebody in place who can actually do the job reliably. So you often get this kind of it's easier to just do it myself mentality. So let's talk about when to hire, which is kind of wrapped up in that barrier issue. If you hire too soon, you run the risk of financial trouble. But if you wait too long, you'll act out of desperation and risk getting the wrong person for your firm. Some signs that you might need to hire in order to grow include that you're turning down client work because you're too busy, your client service is weakening, maybe you've missed deadlines or haven't communicated as clearly with the client as you would otherwise. Things like accounting, paperwork, marketing, and other business tasks might be falling to the wayside because you're so caught up in just the absolute essentials. If you are working constantly, you're probably approaching burnout, especially if your work is in any way dealing with issues that are more stressful than just like the day-to-day stress. So that's a complicated issue. If you're dealing with clients who might be traumatized, that's going to compound that burnout likelihood. Also, if you can't do things like develop and implement a growth strategy, that's a sign that it might be time to hire. If you're reluctant to hire, you might want to look into contractors or remote providers. If you think that you're like not quite there, but you need some help, this could be a really good option. They're available for roles from marketing to accounting to billing. Virtual receptionists are also a great option for answering phone calls and handling client intake. And in the materials that I sent out for you to download, I listed some different vendors that might be good candidates for that. Especially the virtual receptionist world has become that's become a popular niche lately in the past couple of years. So I've kind of categorized the rest of what we're going to talk about into steps of the hiring process. And I try to use pictures that are funny, they're not quite just the average stock photos. This picture, so the first thing that I want to talk about is defining the role that you're trying to fill. So this photo was the photo on the left was done by a police sketch artist. They produced this outlandishly bad image of a crime suspect, which is just, I think most of us feel confident that we probably could have drawn that. But the irony is that people were actually able to use that to catch the suspect. I think he was a burglar or something. But ultimately, my point is that the more work you put into outlining your goals from the get-go, the more success you'll have in, ideally filling that role. So outlining responsibilities. Before you do anything else, you need to develop a strong sense of the role you're trying to fill. You need to actually write this down. It can't just be an idea in your head. And I don't just mean the job description that you're going to use publicly for the job ad. I'm talking about something that you'll use internally, that you might even actually show the candidate once they've been hired. This initial description will be very detailed and designed for internal use, something to eventually share. By taking the time to complete this step, you do a couple of things. First, you help avoid confusion surrounding the employee's responsibilities. Starting a new job is stressful, and by handing your new employee a detailed outline of all of their responsibilities, you increase their odds of being successful. Further, it helps add clarity to the functioning of your entire team. Individuals need to know their role in order to perform it well. They'll be better able to collaborate if they know their role in a workflow. The pictures that I included on this slide, if you Google the phrase, "that's not my job," these are some of my favorite images that showed up. So it's people who kind of went out of their way to avoid doing work that isn't in their job description. But my point is that if you really outline all of the different roles in a workflow, you're gonna help avoid moments like that. Speaking of teams, this is not something that you should do alone. Consult with the individuals your new hire will eventually be working with and get their feedback. This makes current employees feel valued and heard while increasing the accuracy of the job description. Once you have that very detailed internal description created, you can shorten it to create the job description that you use in your advertisement. The job description you include for public use should be short and honest. It should explain the position, outline expected duties in shorter detail than the full one, and describe where the role fits in your organization. Think about what will be required of the person in this role for them to be successful. Are clients late in paying their bills and this person has to call them? If so, do they need to be tenacious, persistent, and able to handle some nasty comments without crying? If you hire a deeply sensitive person to fill this role, they probably won't be your employee for very long, and you'll be right back where you started. Last but not least, your job description needs to include compensation information. This is a pet peeve of mine as somebody who has been very heavy in the job search at different points in my life. Before I wound up in the legal world, I worked for a company that closed, and so I was kind of just looking for anything and I was sending out applications everywhere. And by listing a salary range, at least a range, it doesn't have to be like the exact amount, you increase your odds of finding an appropriately qualified candidate, because self-aware candidates can usually use a salary range to determine whether they're over or underqualified for the role. If you're new to a field or you're like in any way entry level and you see a job description that like maybe the description sounds like it might be entry level, but then you look at the salary and it's like for over 100,000, you know that that's probably not, you're not going to get that. And vice versa, if you're very qualified and you see a posting for a job that's like 40,000, you're going to realize that's not what I'm looking for. So it saves everyone's time, and you don't waste anyone's time, which is a really important thing to me as somebody who's been on the other end of this. So imagine the ideal candidate, and this kind of ties into what I was getting at with the criminal sketch. Before you can imagine an ideal candidate, you need to define your firm's culture and core values. Your ideal candidate is someone who can fit in with what you're trying to achieve. Don't be shy in talking about or publicizing these values with a candidate or on your website. If a candidate is looking for a casual 9-to-5 job and your firm values self-sacrifice and high work volume, it might not be a great fit, and they might be able to realize that on their own if you communicate it clearly during the interview, or on your website even. Once you have that mission in mind, you can start to imagine your ideal candidate for the role. So some other things to think about. Desired experience level, and more experience isn't always better. The job that I did wind up getting after that very long job search a couple years ago was a paralegal role, and the firm was very specific about wanting to hire people who didn't have other experience at law firms. They liked fresh candidates, and because they liked to be able to train them. They liked a fresh slate. Soft skills are important, especially in a role that's client-facing, and soft skills might even be more important than experience, and that is going to come more into play when you start interviewing people. You'll realize pretty quickly whether or not they have soft skills. Personality traits, which we'll talk about more on the next slide. Also think about what you're offering the candidate and how likely your ideal candidate is to be attracted to that. So like salary, benefits. If you want somebody who is very experienced but you're only offering a pretty meager salary, you're probably not going to get that person. So be realistic. But don't box yourself in. Remember, strong diversity and inclusion improves employee engagement and allows for a variety of perspectives that can increase creativity and innovation. Diversity in the legal industry is rare, So it's good to make hiring diverse teams a priority. We'll talk more in a couple slides about how to broaden your applicant base, but you should also consider blind hiring systems that mask personal data right from the get-go, so you're not seeing things like names, etc. Personality matching. So there's this 5-category tool that comes from an academic paper. I listed the authors in your materials and a link to a more in-depth analysis of this if you're interested. But basically, these people break major employee personality categories into 5 categories. So neuroticism, this is an emotionally reactive, anxious, stressful personality type. These people are often in bad moods, with diminished decision-making skills. Low scorers tend to be calm, emotionally stable, more composed, and less reactive. But again, this just kind of goes, these aren't necessarily value negative or positive judgments. People with high neuroticism scores tend to be really good in like academic environments. Scientists tend to score pretty high on these. So it just depends on what you're looking for. Extroversion is the second category. These are people who enjoy being with people. They're full of energy. Introverts, on the other hand, tend to be quiet, low-key, deliberate. If you are looking for somebody who's going to be dealing with clients a lot, you probably want somebody who scores higher in this category. Openness to experience is the third category. These people enjoy change and variety. They like to learn. They're individualistic and non-conforming. So low scorers prefer the plain, straightforward, and obvious over the complex, etc. And you can read a lot more about these in the materials. It goes much more into depth. But the fourth category is agreeableness, and then the fifth is conscientiousness. And by really having a sense of these categories and using them to analyze people or to build that ideal candidate that we were talking about, you can help find a better match. And you can also use these categories to develop adjectives to use in your job posting to increase the likelihood that you might get somebody who fits these characteristics. And you want to think about not just what traits will be best received by you, but by team members or clients. So you can talk to your team members and think about who they work best with also. So some examples of those adjectives that I mentioned just a second ago. Adjectives that are associated with the personality types that we talked about. Some examples are self-aware, articulate, trustworthy, organized, self-disciplined, metrics-driven, collaborative, adaptive. Once you have your job advertisement, what do you do with it? How should you go about finding candidates? So there's always word of mouth, so letting people know that you're hiring. I think the danger of word of mouth is it's a real hindrance to that diversity factor that we talked about, because I think that's one of the reasons why the legal world has been like self-propagating these diversity issues, is because when you hire only within your network, you're going to probably hire people who look like you or are from similar backgrounds as you. So while that's a good starting point, you probably don't want to rely on it too heavily. Your firm's website, you can have a careers section of your website where potential candidates can learn about job openings, and you want to keep that area up to date so people know that they can rely on it. Law school career offices are a great option. Schools have a vested interest in getting their graduates jobs, so advertise through their channels and you can like piggyback off of their work. Job websites such as ZipRecruiter, LinkedIn, Monster, Indeed, Career Builder, FindLaw's Law Career Center, and lawjobs.com are all good starting points. I've heard a lot about ZipRecruiter in the past. I have not used it personally, but I've heard that that's a pretty good tool for employers. And lastly, recruiters. These will cost you money, but the expanded reach and screening capability might pay off. Recruiters with a good track record of finding diverse talent can be a useful way of broadening that applicant pool like we talked about before. So next you want to start collecting applications. This gets into another pet peeve of mine. Send some kind of email notifying the person that you have received their application. It doesn't have to be fancy. A template will do. You can use MailChimp to set something up that just generates like an automatic reply. Again, as someone who has applied for a lot of jobs, it can be really nerve-wracking to not hear a single thing once you've submitted an application. Just a confirmation of receipt really goes a long way. You can kind of wonder, did they get it? Did it not go through? Especially if you're applying through a third-party platform. Also, let candidates know when you won't be moving forward with them and when you've ruled them out of the applicant pool. You don't have to elaborate, but it's kind to keep people updated. One of the most frustrating aspects of applying for jobs is waiting for a response from the company in question. Be clear by communicating with candidates when they are still in the running for the position or if you have decided to move forward with other people. The picture on this slide is from an email that I'm not sure who this was for. I just found it online, but they must have applied for a job at Airbnb. And Airbnb sent out this email that it doesn't elaborate. It doesn't really open the door to have to like explain why they didn't choose you. It just says, thank you for applying. We've decided to not move forward, but we'll keep your application on file for future. That's wonderful. It's a very polite way to just keep people in the loop. You also want to, before we get into the interview part, I want to stress that you need to prepare before an interview. I once went to an interview during which the interviewer repeatedly addressed me as Sarah. My name is Anne, and I told him that, and he just kept doing it. And honestly, I was in a real pinch at that point in my life, and had I been offered that job, I don't know that I would have taken it, which says a lot. So you really want to know what you're walking into, but above all, just be honest, responsive, and thankful for a candidate's time. So let's talk a little bit more about screening and interviews. When going through applications, first divide them into two categories, maybe and not interested. Candidates who didn't include the information you requested, aren't qualified, or seem to have sent a blanket cover letter or response can be weeded out immediately. They can go right into that not interested pile. From there, you can either start interviewing or trim down the maybe list to a reasonable number of candidates to interview. And a great way to do that is with a phone interview. If you don't feel able to eliminate any of those maybes, but you have too many to conduct a formal interview, you don't have that amount of time to commit to it, you might want to start out with a phone interview. This might help you screen out an applicant that isn't really qualified, is vague about their experience, or isn't a good communicator. This is when those soft skills are really going to start to become apparent. A phone interview is also a good time to confirm wage expectation, again, before anyone wastes anyone else's time. After that initial screen, it's a good idea to create an interview scale to use for every candidate. This helps reduce unconscious bias. It can look like a chart or a list with the job requirements that you specified and a numbering scale or a space for notes. Just you can go through and check off the experience that you requested when they specify that they have it, etc. And it's a good thing to refer to after the fact. The formal interview. Experience is important, but you want to ask questions that get at more than just skill. You want to actually get a sense of the candidate's personality and whether or not they share your values. Watch for physical reactions while listening to the words they use to respond to your questions. Using behavioral interview questions requires that the candidate share an example or cite a situation tying their resume claims back to an actual experience. They also give you time to listen, learn, and evaluate. They also give the candidate time to either shine or really spin out and start to reveal themselves as a bad candidate, which is why I included this picture from the show Parks and Recreation. This is somebody being interviewed on the news, and it just says human disaster. So you want to use these kind of like simulation-based questions to just let the candidate sit back and talk. Effective behavioral interview questions have 3 common characteristics. They're easy to answer if the candidate really does have the experience. They're asked for a specific reason, so you're looking for something specific out of it. You're not asking just to ask it. And they're job related, so not really related to personal life or anything. So an example of this is, how do you deal with deadlines? the candidate says pretty good, then the behavioral version of that question, because you don't really get much out of that pretty good answer or pretty well, you can rephrase the question and say, you're working on a project that's up against a tight deadline. Suddenly, a bunch of new work comes in and you anticipate that you might not finish on time. How would you handle this situation? And a behavioral answer would look like, I would huddle up with my team and see if we could work together or ask for help, or I'd just be late, things happen, etc. So you really learn a lot more about the candidate by asking the question in that way. I included a link in the materials to a behavioral-based hiring question generator if this is something that you want a little bit of help with that can assist you. Don't ever skip the step of checking references. Even if you have to take a few days to connect with the individuals, this is an essential step. I don't know that I have ever had my references actually called during an interview, because they have never, I've asked people, like, did this place call you? And they've said, nope, which is pretty shocking to me. And here in this cartoon, you can see somebody's applying for the job, and so he calls the reference, and it's actually just the candidate. His cell phone starts ringing. Some good questions to ask your references. Would you hire the employee again? Is there a time when the employee impressed you? How would you describe their work ethic? Can you verify the title that they listed on their resume? Did they get along with their peers? Were they a team player? How often did they receive a salary adjustment or raise? That last one especially helps you understand what they're used to and what they might expect. If they were in a role before where they got raises every 6 months, isn't that the dream? Then they might, if you don't have that capacity, they might feel pretty dissatisfied quickly, and you might be looking at a shorter term employee. Once you have it down to 2 to 4 candidates, you might want to conduct an interview with the candidate and every member of their potential direct team. Hold the meeting all together with everyone. The hiring manager should lead the discussion with a list of behavioral questions, but employees should also be allowed to ask their own questions. Note any signs of friction. Watch body language and eye contact of all the parties in the room, not just the candidate. This meeting gives you a good glimpse of how the group may converse in front of clients, so be observant. That's an important piece of it. Debrief afterwards and ask the team for their feedback and notes. Notice if you have to sell the candidate to your current employees, or if others are semi-infatuated with a certain personality. It's easy to overlook the bad when you really like someone as a person. Make sure that this person can actually handle the job and fit in well with the team. And then I just want to remind everyone about some illegal questions that I mention these especially because they might come up in small talk, especially the first few, and so that's something to just avoid and be aware of. Questions related to marital status, plans to have children, drug and alcohol use, national origin, and other protected characteristics that might all be illegal. So avoid those even just in your pre-interview small talk. So then you want to actually make the offer. Once you have reviewed all of your notes, references, and compensation budget, prepare your offer letter. It should contain the date, name of the position, start date, salary, and a brief job description. It should be signed and returned within a set time frame also. The candidate should display enthusiasm and return the documents promptly. If they don't, that's a red flag. And of course, anytime you hear the word offer, you think of Marlon Brando and The Godfather. So there he is. All right, so once that is all done, I think the really important stuff begins. And even though it's kind of like technically the epilogue of hiring. So onboarding. Studies show that 69% of employees who are properly onboarded stay longer, up to 3 years, and get up to speed 25% faster. So even if you're completely unconcerned with employee happiness and well-being, which I certainly hope you aren't, there's a real financial incentive to having a solid onboarding practice. If you've hired someone with little law firm experience, you're going to need to start at zero. First-time law firm employees probably won't be familiar with law firm operations and ethical obligations held by attorneys. Client confidentiality might need to be spelled out. Additionally, just because you've hired a millennial doesn't mean they're automatically going to be comfortable with technology. That is a very big misconception. They might have some proficiency, but most people don't think about issues like security until they have to. So you really need to spell out your tech policies very carefully and explicitly. When I first started working at a law firm, I had zero legal background. I worked in music before that. And when I started, I didn't get the concept of like the billable hour even. And so people started talking about that, and I was like, what? Pardon? I'm billing people for my time, but I'm not getting the money? I didn't get it. So you have to, if you're hiring someone with no experience, you have to be really explicit. On the other hand, even if your hire is very experienced in the legal world, every firm will still have different procedures. You still need to consider specific training for handling files, either physical or paperless, requirements when working with clients, how to optimize scheduling, specifics related to safeguarding client information, and the technology related to all of these considerations, which is probably quite a few moving parts, and who to talk to if stress or other concerns become a problem. An employee won't perform well or feel satisfied with their work, at least for some time, if this process is not taken seriously. Talk to your current employees, if you have current employees, and ask for their feedback on their onboarding experience. They can help you learn what was done well and help you recognize any pain points. Lastly, always be sure to provide context for everything in training. Your employee needs to understand how their work contribution fits into the overall picture of your firm, the big picture. You can train them to use software or perform a task, but if they don't understand why they're doing something, it's not going to connect fully. Then the first week. So before the employee gets there, you want to give them a welcome sheet before they start. This should include information like their daily hours, the dress code, computer login and email information, etc. And this should go without saying, but make sure you actually have all that ready to go on their start day, like the computer, basic office supplies, etc. A new employee's first week in the office shouldn't be expected to new employees in their first week in the office shouldn't be expected to deliver instant return. How many times have you seen a new employee practically sitting on their hands the first half of their first day? It's pretty common. Investing the time to really properly train employees when they first start is the fastest way to see an immediate impact on your business, often reducing the training curve from the average 3-month ramp up period to 1 month. Having some kind of like very specific training in place for that first week really increases profitability down the line. You want to have their schedule for that first week mapped out pretty clearly so they're not just sitting around. First week productivity failures boil down to a few factors. The law firm is not prepared, IT equipment, human resource documents, insurance, and a training schedule have not been prepared. The employee doesn't understand the way the firm operates or what each person's role is. And that's a big one, and especially if you're at a big firm, that's going to take time. That's not going to be immediate. I think it's pretty common for the HR person to walk the new employee around that first day and introduce them to everyone. At a big firm, that's not going to stick. You're going to need to do that. Have like a luncheon or something where they can actually get to know people because it's just overwhelming otherwise. The employee isn't given training guidance or resources, and software or technology training is overlooked. Have the employee's time that first week planned out for them. Have a written list of the new employee's daily, weekly, or monthly responsibilities. Then make sure you actually train them to be prepared to complete those things. Management. This is the last of my funny pictures. This is a still from a 30 Rock episode, if anyone's familiar with that. Where they go on a management retreat called the Retreat to Move Forward. It's very punny. And the workshop topics are kind of what you think of when you think about like a management retreat. But management is very important. Now that you are through with the hiring process, management has to take over. Keeping a regular schedule of simple management activities helps keep your finger on the pulse of your business and fosters employee growth. These 3 time-sensitive tactics will keep you and your employees on track. So first, you want to reprimand at the onset of an issue, right at the beginning. I often hear about employees that start off great, then exhibit performance issues after a few months. When an employee first works with you and a problem happens, you have to confront the issue head on. And you can be kind, it doesn't have to be, reprimand is kind of a strong word, but you kind of have to nip it in the bud. By avoiding confrontation of addressing an issue or mistake later on, you can actually train the employee to think that attention to detail or accuracy is more important. So the second aspect are you want to have daily or weekly huddles. Daily is a little bit much, but like a weekly brief team meeting. It's great for projects or teams that work autonomously for a period of time. It can be 5 or 10 minutes held on the phone or Skype. Go around in a circle. Everyone answers these 3 questions. What did you work on yesterday? What are you doing today? Are there any obstacles in your way or items that you need help with? It's just a good way to keep everyone in the same loop. It is then the responsibility of the team leader or project manager or office administrator to remove any obstacles and provide resources for help for those who need it and keep a general pulse on deadlines group-wide. And lastly, you want to encourage learning and invest in training. Lunch and learns, sharing tech tips, guest speakers, etc. These are all great ways to make sure that everyone is trained on the skills that they need to succeed, not just survive. Efficiency is your ally, and there's no better way to become efficient than by utilizing the technology and people you have to their fullest potential. Some other good managerial standards: you want to promote open communication, one-on-one time, accept mistakes, it's just a part of the process, equal accountability, reward wins, hold company meetings, and always say thank you. That's a small thing, but it goes a long way. And lastly, I think it's a good idea to look in the mirror and consider, are you a good employer? Especially, this is something that I think really comes into play when we start to talk about hiring millennials. I think people tend to complain that millennials like job hop a lot. They want more than they deserve out of a job right off the bat. But I think it's important to keep in mind these circumstances behind that. If you are only providing 10 days of vacation time, that's really not a sufficient amount of vacation time, by today's standards at least. And if you look at the job market as a whole, you can really see things moving in that direction. The ability to work remotely is huge. That's something that people want a lot, and it shouldn't be terribly difficult with technology these days. Lastly, it's important to instill a sense of like value in the job, and by value I mean values and like larger values. You kind of see this trend towards like ethical consumption. I think in a lot of different businesses they're trying to tie in like environmental standards or like working in volunteering, providing employees with hours to spend volunteering, things like that. So it's just a good idea to keep in mind that you want to be a desirable employer. If you have poor retention rates, this is probably something to think about. I included some links specifically about what millennials want from a job. Of course, that's just one side of the puzzle. I think it's just something that I hear about a lot. I am a millennial, so that might be why. But especially, they're going to be the new employees at this point, I think, for the most part. So it's an important thing to think about. All right, and that is all I have for you. Does anybody have any questions in the room or online? Anybody?
You mentioned about the different personality and rating scales on those 5 types of personalities. Is that something that you are actually testing candidates on, or asking them to go to a quiz or something?
Right. So for the webcast audience, the question in the room was, when I talked about those 5 personality traits, is that something that you're actually like scoring candidates on? No, not formally. I'm sure there's probably some kind of platform out there that will allow you to do it. Or you can also use, if you like that kind of a metric where you like to have something a little bit more concrete to work with, there's always like Myers-Briggs, which actually in doing research for this presentation, I found out that Myers-Briggs was a tool to help integrate women into the workplace when women started having like full-time jobs in like the 60s, 50s. I thought that was very interesting. I didn't know that. But anyways, no, what I was talking about, no, that was not something that you're actually going to be like scoring. It was more a way to think about framing that like ideal candidate and thinking about what you want to see exhibited from people, and then developing like job ads and interview questions that are going to bring those out. Yeah.@Anybody else? If you have any issues or any questions, just shoot me an email. My email is ahaag@chicagobar.org, and I'm always happy to help. All right. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thanks.